You feel weak, not just tired, but weak in a place you can't quite explain. And that feels strange because you haven't quit. You haven't walked away. You're still moving forward. And yet something inside you feels unsteady, as if you're quietly failing. This video isn't here to accuse you or correct you. It's here to look honestly at that feeling and to question whether it really means what you think it means. As we go through this, you'll discover why this weakness can show up even when nothing went wrong, why it can appear in people who are still standing, and why trying to be stronger doesn't always fix it. We're going to reorganize the way you interpret this inner state and show you how God draws near in moments like this, not with pressure, but with direction. Now take a moment and think carefully. When did this feeling begin? Was it after a long season of pressure, after responsibilities piled up, after expectations that never really let up? Have you been living on autopilot while trying to keep everything standing on the inside? If any of those questions describe what you're carrying, stay here. Understanding what's happening can completely change how you see yourself and how you see this season of your life. There's a very specific discomfort that appears when you feel weak, yet know this doesn't match who you are. You look at your own journey and realize you've always been someone who carried responsibility, kept commitments, and kept going even when it was hard. That's why when this feeling shows up, it creates confusion before it creates pain. This isn't an obvious weakness. It's not a lack of desire to live, and it's not a wish to quit. It's something quieter, more subtle. It's as if the structure is still standing, but something inside has lost its firmness. And that gap between outer appearance and inner state creates confusion because you can't find a clear reason to explain what you're feeling. Many people describe this as running on autopilot. You keep waking up, working, solving problems, fulfilling roles. But it feels like you're doing everything with a smaller and smaller emotional reserve. It's not that you can't keep going, it's that continuing starts to cost more than it used to. When this kind of weakness appears, the mind goes into alert mode. It tries to find a cause quickly. It asks, "Where did I go wrong?" Or, "What's wrong with me?" And when it can't find an objective answer, it begins creating internal explanations that almost always turn into self-criticism. This matters because not all pain comes from failure. Some pain comes from continuity, from staying strong for too long, from carrying pressures that never ease up, from holding expectations that never loosen their grip. But because this doesn't look dramatic enough, people learn to ignore the signals until they become hard to hide. There's also a quiet fear in admitting this weakness. Fear of seeming ungrateful, fear of seeming unstable, fear that acknowledging weariness means losing control. So instead of looking inward with honesty, people clench their teeth and push forward, hoping the feeling will disappear on its own. The problem is that when weakness isn't acknowledged, it doesn't vanish. It changes form. It turns into constant irritation, difficulty concentrating, a sense of emptiness, a nameless emotional weight. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between normal tiredness and accumulated exhaustion. It's in this context that Jesus' words in Matthew 26:41 take on a much deeper meaning. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He didn't say this to rebellious people or to those who were distant. He said it to committed disciples who wanted to stay alert, but were under intense emotional pressure. Jesus doesn't treat this weakness as a moral failure. He doesn't connect this limit to a lack of love or faith. He recognizes something we often forget. Wanting to remain faithful doesn't cancel the impact of human weariness. The desire to do what is right doesn't erase the effect of sustained pressure on the mind and body. That verse reveals an essential distinction. There's a difference between not wanting to do something and not being able to sustain it for too long. There's a difference between abandonment and exhaustion. When those two are confused, people begin to accuse themselves unfairly, as if reaching a limit were proof of spiritual decline. And the more that inner accusation grows, the harder rest becomes. Rest starts to feel like guilt. Stopping feels like failure. Acknowledging limits feels like a flaw in character, so a silent cycle forms. You're too tired to keep going the same way, but too guilty to stop. Maybe you recognize yourself in this. Maybe the weakness you feel didn't appear overnight. Maybe it's the result of many days carrying more than you should have, without space to reorganize what's happening inside. And that doesn't mean you're far from God. It simply means you're human. Before any attempt to change, there's an honest question that needs to be asked. Do I feel weak because I lost something essential, or because I've been carrying too much without realizing the cost? That question doesn't accuse, it creates awareness. And awareness always comes before restoration. For now, don't try to fix anything. Just observe. Notice how you've been interpreting this feeling. Notice whether you've been calling weakness something that might simply be a sign that something needs to be understood more clearly. Because giving the wrong name to what you feel doesn't just hurt, it also confuses the path forward. When something inside you starts to feel heavy without a clear explanation, the mind shifts into urgency. It doesn't tolerate ambiguity well. It prefers an imperfect answer over silence. So when this diffuse weakness appears, the immediate impulse is to label it, even without understanding what's really happening. Giving it a name creates a brief sense of control. When you think, this is weakness, this is failure, this is a lack of faith, the mind feels like it's found the source. But that relief doesn't last. Because when the name is wrong, everything that follows becomes misaligned as well. This is a common pattern among responsible, committed people who are used to carrying a lot. They feel an inner discomfort and quickly turn it into judgment. Instead of asking, what is this signaling? They ask, what's wrong with me? And that shift in question completely changes the inner experience. When interpretation turns into accusation, the emotional state worsens. The weariness that was already there doesn't decrease. It gains an extra layer of weight. You don't just suffer from being tired, you suffer from feeling guilty for being tired. And you end up fighting yourself, trying to eliminate a feeling you don't understand. That inner conflict consumes energy that was already scarce. Instead of helping, the mind creates more tension, more rigidity, more pressure. And the harder you try to correct yourself, the farther you drift from the clarity you actually need. Scripture recognizes the power of these inner interpretations. Proverbs 23:7 says that as a person thinks in their soul, so they become. This isn't about superficial positive thinking. It's about the ongoing effect that inner narratives have on identity, decisions, and the way life is lived. When you interpret a sign of weariness as personal failure, you begin to act from that label. You close yourself off emotionally. You isolate. You try to compensate with more effort, more control, more rigidity. But effort applied to a wrong interpretation almost always deepens the problem instead of solving it. Many people spend long seasons trying to fix something that was never the real issue. They increase pressure, intensify disciplines, force themselves to be stronger. But none of that reaches the core, because the root isn't a lack of commitment, it's the way the inner state was named from the beginning. That mistaken interpretation also affects the relationship with God. You begin approaching Him with caution instead of openness. You pray defensively, explaining yourself, justifying yourself, trying to prove you still belong. And that emotional distance wasn't created by God. It was created by the label your own mind attached to what you were feeling. It's important to notice how a tired mind loses nuance. Everything becomes extreme. Either I'm fine or I'm failing. Either I'm strong or I'm weak. That rigid logic doesn't reflect how God sees a person. It reflects a mind trying to survive inner confusion. When a feeling isn't understood, it becomes a threat. But when it's understood, it becomes information. Information doesn't accuse, it guides. And guidance always brings more peace than judgment. What you've been calling weakness may actually be an alert, a signal that something needs to be reviewed, reorganized, realigned. But as long as the name is wrong, that signal will be fought, ignored, or suppressed instead of heard. Before seeking strength, there's something more essential: seeking clarity. Before trying to change how you feel, you need to understand what that feeling is communicating, because fighting a signal doesn't make it disappear. It only makes it more confusing and heavier over time. So for now, consider this possibility calmly. What if the problem isn't what you feel, but the name you've been giving that feeling? That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It simply opens space for a more honest listening to what's happening inside you. There is a kind of weariness that doesn't come from a specific event. It doesn't appear after a clear crisis, an obvious loss, or a visible collapse. It forms gradually, through continuity. It shows up when someone stays strong for too long without noticing the inner cost of doing so. This kind of weariness is hard to identify because it has no clear starting point. There's no well-defined before and after. There's only the sense that something has been accumulating while life kept moving. And because there was no breakdown, the person assumes everything is fine, even when it isn't. Staying strong for a long time often becomes an identity. People begin to rely on you, decisions pass through you, responsibilities land on you. And little by little, the idea of stopping, slowing down, or asking for space starts to feel impossible, almost dangerous. This kind of strength is quiet. It doesn't draw attention. It doesn't receive care. It's simply expected. And when something is constantly expected, the mind begins to treat it as obligation rather than choice. You keep carrying because it feels like there is no alternative. But the soul also records the effect of repetition without pause. Even when there's no drama, it feels the weight of constancy. Always solving, always being available, always holding things together. All of this requires emotional energy. And emotional energy is not endless. Over time, a person begins to function on autopilot. They do what needs to be done, but without full presence. They respond, but they don't feel. They execute, but they don't engage. And this inner distance is a clear sign that something is being sustained beyond a healthy limit. Isaiah 40:30 states this plainly and honestly: "Even youths grow tired and weary." This verse doesn't point to spiritual failure. It points to human limitation. It acknowledges that even those with strength, energy, and vigor reach a point of weariness when the load is constant. Many people don't allow themselves to be tired because they confuse tiredness with failure. They believe that slowing down means losing value, that admitting limits means disappointing someone, so they remain steady on the outside while something on the inside begins to empty. This emptying doesn't happen dramatically. It shows up in subtle signs: constant irritation, difficulty enjoying what once felt meaningful, a sense of always being emotionally behind, the feeling that life is happening, but you're not really inside it. There's also a quiet isolation. Those who carry a lot rarely feel comfortable saying they're tired. There's an invisible pressure to maintain an image of stability. And the more that image is preserved, the less space there is for real vulnerability. Weariness deepens when comparison enters in. You start thinking others deal with worse things, that you don't have the right to feel this way, that you should be more grateful, more resilient, stronger, and that comparison invalidates your own experience, pushing the limit even further. But the body and the mind don't function on comparison, they function on reality. And the reality is that no human being was created to carry everything alone, indefinitely, without inner reorganization. When that happens, weakness doesn't appear as failure. It appears as a warning. Maybe the feeling you're carrying today isn't a sign that something is broken. Maybe it's a sign that something has been sustained for too long without space for conscious rest. And recognizing that changes your inner posture completely. Instead of accusing yourself, you begin to observe more honestly. Before moving forward, an inner pause is worth taking. Not to quit, but to acknowledge. To acknowledge how much you've been carrying, to acknowledge how strong you've been, and to acknowledge that continuous strength without care always comes at a cost, even when no one sees it. If this content is helping you understand what's happening inside you more clearly, consider subscribing to the channel. These videos aren't made to pressure or correct, but to walk alongside real processes with clarity and respect. Staying here may help you move through this season with less guilt and more awareness. After a long time of carrying more than seems possible, something inside begins to signal. It's not an immediate collapse. It's not an open crisis. It's a persistent, almost subtle discomfort, as if the soul were trying to get your attention. And most of the time, this signal is interpreted as a problem, when in fact, it's communication. These signals don't appear to accuse, they appear to alert. The soul doesn't start by shouting, it starts by whispering, a tiredness that doesn't go away with ordinary rest, a sense of heaviness that shows up even on calm days, a loss of enthusiasm that's hard to explain. Small inner shifts that indicate something needs to be looked at more carefully. The problem is that many people were trained to ignore these kinds of signals. Taught to push forward at any cost, to not stop, to not make room for discomfort. So when the soul signals, the automatic response is to harden, speed up, resist, and that usually deepens exactly what needed care. There's an important difference between continuing and continuing consciously. Continuing by itself is not a virtue. Continuing without noticing the cost is what creates weariness. The soul begins to signal when it realizes the current pace is no longer aligned with the inner capacity to sustain what's being lived. It's at this point that Jesus' words in Matthew 11:28 take on an even deeper meaning. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. Notice carefully. He doesn't call the quitters. He doesn't summon those who walked away. He calls the weary, those who are still walking but carrying too much. This invitation reveals a great deal about God's posture. He doesn't wait for someone to break before drawing near. He doesn't require a limit to become failure. He comes close before the fall. He recognizes the weight before the collapse, and he doesn't ask for explanations or justifications. He offers direction and conscious rest. When the soul signals, it's not asking for everything to be abandoned. It's asking for adjustment, for inner reorganization. Ignoring that request doesn't make a person stronger. It only makes them more distant from themselves. And the greater that distance becomes, the harder it is to see what truly needs to change. Many people move through this phase by insisting on doing more of the same. They keep the same patterns, the same demands, the same inner logic. And as a result, the initial signal intensifies, not because God is absent, but because listening was postponed for too long. It's important to understand that discomfort isn't always an enemy. Sometimes it's a tool. It interrupts autopilot. It slows the mind down. It forces an inner pause. It invites a person out of survival mode and into awareness. And that almost never happens without some initial unease. The soul begins to signal when it realizes continuing the same way is no longer sustainable. It indicates that something needs to be reviewed before the weight becomes unbearable. Recognizing this isn't weakness. It's maturity. It's understanding that strength without inner alignment turns into silent burden. At this moment, the invitation isn't to quit, but to reposition, to look honestly at what's being carried, to discern what needs adjustment, not elimination, to understand that God doesn't withdraw when the soul asks for attention. He draws near. Maybe this season you're living isn't a setback. Maybe it's a point of inner transition, a moment when life asks for less rigidity and more listening, less self-pressure and more awareness. And that shift begins exactly when you decide to take seriously the signals rising from within. For now, don't try to solve everything. Simply acknowledge, calmly, something inside you is asking for attention, and that doesn't mean you're failing. It simply means your soul is trying to guide you toward a more conscious way of continuing. When the word weakness appears in the Bible, it doesn't carry the accusatory tone that a tired mind often attaches to it. For many people, weakness has become a synonym for spiritual failure, as if feeling a limit were proof that something is wrong with their faith. But Scripture treats this subject with far more depth and honesty than that simplified reading allows. Much of the confusion begins when weakness is mixed with sin, neglect, or distance from God. A person feels tired, feels momentarily incapable, feels unable to sustain the same pace, and concludes that they are failing spiritually. Yet this conclusion doesn't reflect the way God relates to human beings throughout the Bible. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, Paul describes an experience that directly confronts this logic. He says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul isn't talking about rebellion or spiritual carelessness. He's speaking about something that remained despite his prayers, his requests, and his effort, something that was not removed. God's response is revealing. God doesn't say, "Overcome this, and then I will act." He doesn't require Paul to become stronger before deserving help. He declares that grace is already sufficient precisely at that point of limitation. This completely changes how weakness is interpreted. It stops being an obstacle and becomes the context. This passage shows that weakness doesn't push God's action away. On the contrary, it can become the place where God's power is revealed more clearly. Not because weakness is good in itself, but because it dismantles the illusion of self-sufficiency that so often blocks real dependence. The Bible never presents human limitation as shameful. Human beings were created finite, dependent, in need of support. God has never treated this condition as a spiritual defect. The one who turns limitation into guilt is usually the mind itself, pressured by unrealistic expectations of constant performance. The problem arises when faith is confused with self-sufficiency, when a person believes that trusting God means never feeling weak, never needing to stop, never admitting they've reached a limit. This idea creates a spirituality that looks strong on the outside but is exhausted on the inside. Paul understood something many people only realize after great suffering. He recognized that hiding his weakness distanced him from grace, while acknowledging it aligned him with truth. Real dependence is not failure, it is spiritual maturity. The Bible never glorifies strength that ignores limits. It doesn't praise those who carry everything alone. On the contrary, it repeatedly reveals that God acts when a person stops trying to prove strength and begins to recognize need, when they stop sustaining an image and start living with inner honesty. It's also important to understand what the Bible does not call weakness. It doesn't call simple tiredness weakness. It doesn't call feeling overwhelmed weakness. It doesn't call needing help or feeling vulnerable weakness. These states are part of the human experience in a real world with real pressures. When you understand this, the tone of your relationship with God changes. Prayer stops being defensive. You no longer need to explain yourself or justify yourself. You come as you are. And that posture creates space for real rest, not pressure disguised as spirituality. Perhaps the greatest freedom in this point is realizing that the weakness you feel does not disqualify you. It doesn't exclude you from God's presence. It doesn't put you at spiritual risk. When rightly understood, it becomes the place where grace meets less resistance to act. For now, simply hold on to this redefinition calmly. The Bible calls weakness what reveals human limitation, not what proves an absence of faith. And understanding this difference profoundly changes how you see yourself, how you relate to God, and how you move through this season of your life. There is a quiet moment when something begins to reorganize inside. It isn't an emotional explosion. It isn't a sudden sense of victory. It's more subtle than that. It's the moment when a person starts to suspect that maybe the problem was never failure, but accumulation. And that realization changes how everything is felt. Guilt often comes from constantly comparing what you feel with what you believe you should feel. You look inward and think you should be steadier, more stable, stronger. And by measuring your reality with an unrealistic standard, you quietly accuse yourself for not meeting it. When you understand that the weariness didn't come from disobedience, but from prolonged overload, something shifts inside. The inner narrative changes. Instead of "I am failing," it becomes "I am carrying more than I can sustain." This change isn't just semantic. It alters the emotional weight you carry every day. The Bible describes this movement clearly in 1 Peter 5:7, casting all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. The text doesn't suggest denying the weight or enduring it in silence. It speaks of transfer, of stopping the habit of holding alone what has already become too heavy to carry. Many people learned to carry everything alone, believing it was virtue. They were taught that enduring without complaint was a sign of spiritual maturity, that admitting limits was weakness, that asking for help showed a lack of faith. Over time, this logic builds a spirituality that is tired and isolated. Guilt begins to fall when you realize that carrying everything alone was never God's plan. Overloading yourself is not humility. Ignoring your limits is not faith. And living constantly at the edge emotionally is not spiritual maturity meant to prove strength. At this point, something essential becomes clear. God is not asking for more effort. He is not waiting for you to endure just a little longer. He is not measuring your spirituality by how much weight you can carry. He is inviting you to stop accusing yourself and to trust that He cares about what you are feeling now. When this understanding settles in, the inner struggle begins to ease. The mind leaves defensive mode. You stop spending energy justifying yourself all the time. And in that quieter space, something new appears. Inner permission. Permission to not be in control. Permission to not carry everything. This release of guilt doesn't mean challenges disappear. Responsibilities remain. Pressures still exist. But the way you move through them changes. You stop walking while punishing yourself for feeling what you feel. You begin to walk with more awareness and less inner attack. Often it was guilt that made everything heavier than it needed to be. It turned tiredness into shame, limit into failure, need into moral weakness. When guilt begins to fall, the real weight becomes clearer and surprisingly more bearable. This moment requires care, not because it's fragile, but because it's new. The mind tends to return to old patterns of self-demand. It tries to reactivate the logic of pressure. That's why this new reading needs to be held with patience. Guilt doesn't vanish all at once. It dissolves as awareness adjusts. Maybe you are right at this point now, beginning to see that the issue was never a lack of faith, but an excess of accumulated weight, that God is not disappointed in you, that He hasn't withdrawn, and that the guilt you've been carrying may not be necessary to keep going. For now, simply remain with this understanding. Don't rush the process. Allow guilt to keep falling little by little, because when it falls, it opens space for something more real to take its place. Not artificial strength, but a conscious rest that quietly reorganizes the inner life. When you truly understand what's happening inside you, something shifts quietly. It isn't a loud change. It isn't an explosive sense of relief. It's an inner adjustment that reshapes how you relate to your own experience. Life remains demanding, but you stop walking against yourself. The first change happens in how you see yourself. The feeling of being a problem that needs fixing begins to lose its grip. Constant self-criticism softens. You realize you no longer need to monitor yourself all the time or punish yourself for having limits. This inner shift reduces a kind of weariness that was often heavier than the tiredness itself. With this new understanding, you begin to notice your limits with more clarity and less fear. A limit stops being a threat and becomes information. Instead of thinking, "I can't," you start thinking, "I need to organize myself differently." This isn't settling, it's emotional and spiritual intelligence applied to real life. The way you move through everyday life changes as well. You stop responding automatically to pressure. You begin choosing more consciously where to invest energy and where an inner pause is needed. Small adjustments start to matter more because now they're made without guilt. When weakness is no longer interpreted as failure, it stops controlling your decisions. It no longer defines your value or sets the pace of your life. It becomes a legitimate signal calling for attention, not a verdict. And signals, when understood, don't paralyze. They guide with precision. Psalm 23:3 describes this movement simply, "He restores my soul." Restoration is not acceleration. It's not pressure disguised as faith. It's alignment. It's giving the soul back the ability to walk without being constantly at war with itself. This restoration changes the inner atmosphere. The mind grows quieter. The body responds with less tension. Decisions are no longer driven by fear of failure, but guided by clarity. You keep moving forward, but now with less accumulated emotional weight. Your relationship with God changes too. You no longer approach Him trying to justify yourself or prove something. Prayer becomes simpler and more honest. Instead of long explanations, there is presence. Instead of defense, there is openness. And this creates space where faith can breathe. The rest that appears here isn't the absence of movement. It's the absence of inner conflict. You're still dealing with real challenges, real responsibilities, real pressures, but now without attacking yourself for feeling tired, without turning every limit into a sign of spiritual failure. Perhaps the deepest shift is realizing that this season doesn't define who you are. It doesn't sum you up. It doesn't diminish your story. It's a moment that asks for awareness, not condemnation. When you understand this, hope stops being anxious and becomes serene. Serene because you're no longer waiting to become an idealized version of yourself before moving forward. Serene because you learn to walk with what's real today. Serene because you see that God doesn't demand artificial strength. He sustains real processes. This understanding also changes how you look at the future. Instead of waiting for a day when everything is resolved, you learn to live with more presence now. And that presence reduces the sense of inner urgency that once consumed so much energy. If this video has been helping you see your journey with more clarity and less weight, consider subscribing to the channel. The content here isn't meant to push quick changes, but to walk alongside real processes with honesty, depth, and respect. Staying here may help you continue this path with more awareness and less loneliness. For now, simply remain with this new lens. You don't need to rush anything. When understanding arrives, it begins reorganizing the inner world on its own. And that quiet, steady, mature reordering is often the beginning of true restoration. Now, don't do anything in a hurry. Just stay where you are for a few moments. Not to think more or organize ideas, but simply to be present with what has been noticed so far. Some understandings don't deepen through effort, but through silence and inner permission. Perhaps for the first time in a long while, you can look at this sense of weakness without turning it into accusation, without needing to justify yourself, without trying to prove that you're still strong. Simply recognizing that you reached this point because you walked far, carried much, and stayed firm longer than you realized. There is a quiet relief when you stop attacking yourself for having limits, when you admit, without shame, that you can't carry everything alone. This recognition doesn't diminish who you are. It restores your humanity, and God never withdraws from humanity. He draws near to it with care. If you wish, allow yourself to close your eyes for a few seconds. Not to do something right, and not to follow a ritual, just to release inside what you've been holding too tightly, what you carried out of responsibility, what you held out of habit, what you sustained out of fear of falling. Simply imagine handing that weight over, consciously, not as someone giving up, but as someone trusting, not as someone quitting, but as someone recognizing that they don't have to keep going alone right now. This release doesn't need words. It happens in the quiet consent of the heart. Scripture describes this place simply, "In peace I will lie down and sleep." It isn't the peace of having everything solved. It's the peace of having stopped fighting yourself. It's the peace that comes when the soul finds a safe place to rest, even before circumstances change. You don't need to leave here stronger. You don't need to leave renewed on the outside. You don't need to leave different. You only need to leave more honest. Sometimes that's all restoration needs to begin working quietly and steadily. Carry this feeling with you, not as a final answer, but as a gentle care. Let it accompany your next steps, reminding you that limit is not failure and rest is not abandonment. And when self-pressure tries to return, remember this moment, the moment you allowed yourself to stop accusing yourself. Because very often, it's in this simple, quiet place that the soul finally begins to breathe again.